Out. Here we go. Okay. I apologize for the delay. Technology, we love it, but it also is a curse. So we do our best. At any rate, my name is Eleanor Manouk, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Library Committee, Janet Lauderman and Leslie Kinross. So everyone, please stay muted, and we'll open up to questions later, and we'll be able to chat then. We are very fortunate to have two sponsors for today's program, 147 Elder Street and also Susan Columby, Vice President responsible for membership development at the Shul. I'd now like to ask Ty, who is representing 147 Elder Street, to explain a bit about their services. Welcome, Ty.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce my CEO.
Sorry, Ty, you have your phone on and also the audio, and that's why we're getting feedback.
Okay. Okay, is it better now?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I'd like to introduce everyone to my CEO, Sharon Tour, who is currently sitting across from me. She will be speaking on behalf of Elder Street and giving a short little blurb about who we are.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am the CEO for 147 Elder Street. My name is Sharon Tour. I have been part of 147 Elder Street now for 3+ years. We are a dementia-specific facility. We are happy to support our community in all ways we can. So thank you for having us here today. In our facility, dementia is the rule, not an exception. We try to normalize dementia, and we try to normalize everyday life for our residents. This simple truth allows our residents to relax their muscle that works so hard for them all their life and currently. So we work together with our community. We believe in a community approach to bring normalcy to our residents. So thank you so much for letting us sponsor and be part of today for the Lunch and Learn. We are happy to sponsor our library team in the community development and the programs you guys support. Thank you so much for letting us be part of it.
And of Beth, I want to thank you very much and remind everybody to go back to the Zoom invitation, and you will see a lovely Pesach greeting from 147 Elder Street. So thank you both. And it will be our pleasure for you to stay if you can, to hear the presentation or to come in and out, whatever suits you. So thank you so much again from Beth Emmett to 147 Elder Street, and again to Susan Columby for today's sponsorship. We welcome back to Beth Emmett, Cynthia Good, who will review for us Lear's Shadow. This is a bit of a different kind of book than we have discussed in the past. At first blush, it may not appear to have the same academic weight as some of our other choices. However, a little bit of digging will reveal the numerous intricate relationships between fathers and their children, which I'm sure Cynthia will help us explore. For those who have not read Shakespeare, King Lear has 3 daughters. He asks each how much they love him. And the one who loves him the best, the youngest one, is the one who is the least effusive. How can you measure the love between parent and child? Can you ever really articulate it in words that do justice to that love? How does love cloud our perceptions of the parent and what that parent needs? These are a few of the questions that I have, and I hope we will explore together. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cynthia Good.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you, and I hope more people will be able to, as they figure out the new link. I know that I was panicking a little when it wasn't working, but then I went back to my emails and I found the new link that did work. Thank you for that lovely introduction to the book, Eleanor. That was a good way for us to start. Also, a good way for us to start is by the fact that dementia has already been raised as a topic this afternoon. And of course, Lear's Shadow is very much about dementia. I will start with a synopsis of Lear's Shadow. The novel centers on Beatrice Rose, called Bee, and her father, Saul. She has a younger sister, Kara, with whom she is very close, as their mother died when both were young in a car accident with Saul at the wheel. Bee's life and business partner left her for another woman, and she can't run the yoga studio by herself. So she seeks another job and, almost as a lark, accepts a summer job as the assistant stage manager of an outdoor production of King Lear, though she has absolutely no theater experience. After a prologue, the novel opens with Bee going to the theater company meet and greet in a torrential downpour. It turns out that Saul, her father, was also out that night, disoriented by the storm and the protesting students with their pots and pans, the casserole series of nightly protests. That helps us to know that this novel is set in the late spring of 2012. Saul is now in hospital and clearly suffering from some mental issues, soon diagnosed as dementia with Lewy bodies, a dementia often exhibiting violence. When the doctor says Saul will only be intermittently stable, Bee reluctantly moves in with him. Meanwhile, she helps out at rehearsals, working hard and learning as she goes. The important members of the company are these: Phil Burns, who plays Lear, a 69-year-old ladies' man, once fairly successful and still with great talent. Mimi, the director, who is his ex-wife, and Artie White, who plays the fool in the play and was a childhood friend of Bee's, defending her on the playground when she was mocked because of her cleft palate and lip. Performances begin with all of the challenges of outdoor productions. Then Phil has some trouble with his lines, and he faints twice. But with Mimi taking him in and controlling his drinking, he can continue. Bee's sister Kara and her husband own a raw food restaurant. Bee suspects Kara's husband is having an affair with his chef. Saul is even more sure about the infidelity, and at a family brunch is angry and accusatory. Then at a party to celebrate the restaurant's expansion, Saul turns up unexpectedly, sees an intimate moment between Kara's husband and the chef, brandishes a knife, then probably mistakenly stabs Bee in the chest, severely injuring her lungs. Saul is arrested and released to a psychiatric hospital. Kara leaves her unfaithful husband and with her two daughters moves into the family home with Bee and takes over Saul's successful clothing business. Bee recovers slowly, is able to attend the final production of King Lear, and is now in a loving relationship with Artie. The author is Claire Holden Rothman, a Canadian novelist, short story writer, and translator. She has published 3 novels and 2 short story collections. Her first novel, The Heart Specialist, was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize in 2009, and her second, My October, was longlisted for the same prize in 2014, and shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. Lear's Shadow was the winner of the Vine Award for Canadian Jewish Literature in 2019. Rothman is also an award-winning translator. She lives in Montreal with actor and writer Arthur Holden. In the summer of 2011, Claire Rothman herself had just completed the final draft of My October. Exhausted and at loose ends, much like her protagonist, she found the closest thing to, as she calls it, running away to the circus, and served as assistant stage manager for Montreal-based Repercussion Theatre's summertime production of Macbeth. She decided instead of Macbeth to turn to Lear for her next novel because she says she writes about fathers. Rothman's research included an interview with actor Simon Russell Beale, who played Lear in Sam Mendes' 2014 National Theatre production in London. Beale opined that Lear could have been suffering from Lewy body dementia, a brain condition distinct from but often confused with Alzheimer's. The novel is certainly not a retelling of King Lear, and you don't even need to know the play especially well on entry, and you would enjoy the novel for what it is. But even if you think you don't know Shakespeare's King Lear, you'll probably be surprised at how much of its essence you've absorbed through sheer cultural osmosis and collected narrative DNA. Besides, as Rothman points out, Shakespeare himself was standing on the shoulders of an old legend. And now, here are a few notes about Shakespeare's King Lear, with thanks to Eleanor for a good introduction. I'll just fill it in a little more. And Lear is believed by many to be Shakespeare's greatest tragedy. First, the short and funny version. King divides kingdom, snubs daughter, goes mad, there's a storm, and everyone dies. Now, for a larger synopsis, and hopefully as you listen to this, you'll hear echoes of Lear's shadows and Lear's shadow in all of the parallels. Lear, King of Britain, in an attempt to avoid future strife, plans to divide his kingdom between his three daughters. His eldest two, Regan, wife of Cornwall, and Goneril, wife of Albany, respond to his request for a show of love, but Cordelia, his youngest, is unable to, not wanting to be hyperbolic or hypocritical. In a fit of rage, Lear banishes her, and she leaves to marry the King of France. When his closest advisor, Kent, attempts to tell Lear he is doing wrong, he too is banished. There is a parallel plot with the Earl of Gloucester. His bastard son Edmund is planning to gain his brother Edgar's lands by disinheriting him. He convinces Gloucester that Edgar is plotting against him, and then persuades his brother to flee from his father's anger. To avoid arrest, Edgar disguises himself as a mad beggar, Poor Tom. Edmund joins Cornwall to fight for control of the kingdom. When Lear visits Goneril and Regan as part of his original plan, they insist he reduce his retinue to none, basically, and treat him with no respect or love. He leaves the castle in a rage, going out into a violent storm accompanied only by his fool and a disguised Kent. Lear harangues the storm, then meets poor Tom, who he treats as a counselor. Gloucester tells Edmund of his intention to help Lear and advises Kent to take Lear to Dover, where Cordelia and a French army are to be found. But Edmund has informed on Gloucester, and when Gloucester returns to the castle, he is accused of being a traitor, his eyes are put out, and he is thrown into the wilderness. Edgar encounters his blind father, and as poor Tom journeys with him to Dover, where Gloucester finds Lear. Both Goneril and Regan have developed feelings for Edmund, creating a falling out between the two, ultimately leading to their deaths. Lear is found by Cordelia's army, but they are both taken prisoner. An order is sent to cancel Lear and Cordelia's execution, but it arrives too late to save Cordelia. Lear carries her in and soon after dies of a broken heart. Sigmund Freud asserted that Cordelia symbolizes death. Therefore, when the play begins with Lear rejecting his daughter, it can be interpreted as him rejecting death. Lear is unwilling to face the mortality, the finitude of his being. The play's poignant ending scene, where Lear carries the body of his beloved Cordelia, was of great importance to Freud. In this scene, Cordelia forces on Lear the realization of his mortality, or as Freud put it, she causes him to, quote, make friends with the necessity of dying. There are many earlier versions of the Lear and daughter story, but Shakespeare had particular intentions with Cordelia's death. He was the only writer to have Cordelia killed. In one version, she continues to live happily, and in another, she restores her father and succeeds him. And there are biblical echoes to Lear as well, and I'll discuss those later. So let me review for you some of the ways that Rothman has used King Lear, and I will come back to some other parallels later in my presentation. First of all, of course, the title, and we might want to talk about that later. Secondly, the structure. The play has 5 acts, and the book has five acts, and around the same number of scenes. Also, the production of King Lear, the rehearsals and the performances provide a foundation to the book and its forward motion. Fourth, resonance and depth, what Shakespeare and his play can bring. 5, recognition and even delight as we remember Lear. 6, theater lore and the richness and the authenticity of that. 7, some of the themes, and I'll go over them for you now. First of all, the domestic relationships in tragedy, father-daughter, father-sons, and as well the sisters. Then aging, and then dementia, which I would put in separate categories. And then identity. The novel's epigraph sets up the main theme of the novel, identity, both under duress and at different stages of life. Quoting from Lear, "Who is it that can tell me who I am?" And finally, politics. The politics of King Lear are reflected here with the students' revolt. And actually one last one, the Bible. So it has been suggested that the biblical book of Job and his ordeals provide an influence for the trials of Shakespeare's Lear. And literary commentators have some compelling quotes to show similarities. Harold Bloom, in his 1999 book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, also suggests a comparison with the older King Solomon, and he shows parallel quotes. And I have some interesting thoughts about the comparison of King Lear and the binding of Isaac, which I think are somewhat reflected as well. Let's talk about some of the general elements of the novel. It is, as I said, divided into 5 acts, the conventional divisions of 17th century drama, and then into numbered sections, which correspond to scenes. Each act opens with a quotation from Lear, and we realize in reading these how full of memorable quotes that play is. The action of Shakespeare's King Lear takes place over just a few weeks, as the novel takes place over one summer. As I said, the rehearsals and performances presented through the novel also serve to advance the plot as they move through the play. We begin, though, in the novel after the general epigraph about identity with a prologue. And here's the prologue's epigraph. Let me read that to you. It's Kent from King Lear, who says, "Alas, sir, are you here? Things that love night love not such nights as these." Well, this, of course, shows the pathos of both Shakespeare's Lear and the characters of this novel, with "Are you here?" placing an emphasis on setting, the setting of the heath in Shakespeare's play, the setting of Montreal. And the "Are you here?" is also a reference to the madness and identity issues raised in both the play and the novel. And the reference to the weather, which is a continuing symbol of, shall we say, the tempest without and within. What we call pathetic fallacy, a literary device in which human emotions are attributed to aspects of nature, such as the weather. I always like to start talking about a book by looking at the first paragraph. I think it can tell us quite a bit. So here it is. This is the prologue. The old man knows he should watch the road, but he can't. His eyes keep drifting to the black churn of cloud overhead. Nightfall is still an hour away, but the sky is so dark he can't see the white lines on the pavement. He curses, gropes for the headlight switch, pressing buttons and turning knobs to no visible effect. The car plunges through the shadows, down the final stretch of Pine Avenue, past the Royal Victoria Hospital and the grimy stone archway of the Neurological Institute. It weaves across lanes as though driven by someone crazy or blind or both. So the old man opens the book. The old man with the resonance of Lear himself and Phil later in the book. The dark, we have the dark. We have a very specific location, actually. It is where the accident happened, which killed his wife. And in this scene, he is almost re-experiencing it. He passes the Neurological Institute, pointing to Saul's eventual diagnosis. He drives as if crazy or blind. And here again are echoes of the King Lear themes of true and psychological blindness. His loss of control, the nightmare quality, the tempest, where anything can happen and the usual rules do not apply. And we have the politics, we move right into that, the casserole, the student protests. But altogether, there is a feeling of chaos in this beginning. This is a novel firmly planted in Montreal. For those of you who are from there, I'm sure you can picture each street as it is named, each park where the play is performed, and each neighborhood as it is portrayed. Saul's Montreal is also very clear, not the contemporary plateau where much of this is set, but what he calls the Jewish ghetto, Saint-Urbain. Here's what he says. Your street, for instance, he said to Artie, was once a hub of Jewish culture. In the 40s, when I was a kid, practically every Jewish institution of note in Montreal had an address there. The Jewish library was on the corner at Mount Royal. One door down from it, a woman called Ida Mays held these famous literary salons. The Jewish Aid Society was also on that block. And around the corner was the Jewish school I went to. He's upset that his daughters chose to live in the plateau after he worked so hard to escape that place, which reminds me absolutely of how my parents felt when I moved back downtown. I had grown up on Clinton Street in downtown Toronto and moved back onto Brunswick Avenue. And the institutions and the hospitals. Saul was a generous donor to the Samuel Rabinovich Hospital. And although in that disorienting night he didn't know who he was, he knew to insist on that hospital. We will return to the Jewish contents when we discuss the major theme of identity. And if any of you are from Montreal, I'd love to hear your feelings about the setting at the end of the presentation when I open it up for questions and comments. The other aspect of setting in this novel is the setting of the theater, which I love. I was involved with theater when I was young. It gives us some lovely moments of theater lore, which Claire Rothman would have learned from her experience in the Macbeth production, and I recognize from my years in the theater. Like the discussion of the origins of break a leg, which it turns out comes from take a bow. And the very fact that a theater company is always a hothouse of emotions. Relationships, including romance and sex, rise and fall. Friendships develop or falter. Disagreements can erupt into major disruption. As B reflects, backstage drama had eclipsed Shakespeare. But a theater cast and crew are also incredibly tight. As B reflects, they were a troupe, a tribe, bound by traditions of solidarity that were ancient even in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare, we know, thought of the theater, his milieu, as a continuing metaphor for life. The epigraph for Act 3 in the novel is from Lear. When we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools. And of course, there's the great speech from As You Like It. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. Lear's shadow is also in a particular time, late spring 2012, the raw food movement that crudivore depends on amidst environmental concerns. Most important, the student protests and riots, providing a time of unrest and discomfort for the city. And this provides a parallel to the politics of King Lear and its wars. Although the Me Too movement was not yet in full swing, we can feel that the author is pre-shadowing that as well. Now let's begin to explore the major themes and start with old age. Both Phil and Saul represent versions of old age. We can see Phil very clearly in Shakespeare's sixth act. The sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big, manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. This is what Phil is fighting. This is why he turns to drinking and to flirting. We watch his disintegration, and it is well and poignantly portrayed. You will remember the deeply affecting scene where in rehearsal Phil pulls his sweatshirt from his body. Quoting from the novel, he was gone, staring into space, not registering Artie's lines as they came at him. No trace of the proud, vigorous actor remained. In his place was someone much older, someone utterly defenseless and exposed. The sight was so devastating, Bea wanted to run and throw her arms around him. But even more affecting is during the performance when he, as the novel says, lost it altogether. In rehearsal, he had lost his lines at the point where a frustrated and humiliated Lear shouts out to his daughters and their servants, "Does any here know me?" And in performance, it is even more dramatic. Now he staggered about the stage, ignoring the blocking and mumbling all kinds of extraneous nonsense. He blinked into the stage lights. "Does any here know me?" he asked, bewildered. He paused, surveying the crowd as if expecting someone to answer. The audience stopped fidgeting. Phil took a shaky step toward them. "This is not Lear," he said in a voice not much louder than a whisper. "Does Lear walk thus? Speak thus?" He looked like a toddler, unbalanced yet determined, learning how to walk. His hand touched his throat, then his eyes. "Where are his eyes?" he sobbed and fell to his knees. Even from behind, he was riveting. Could not continue. Although ultimately we learn that Phil was just suffering from temporary problems and is not only well enough to perform brilliantly, but also at 70 to attract a much younger woman, he represents through himself and through his performance of Lear the transition to Shakespeare's seventh age, the final stage, and that is where Saul is. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. But even in dementia, we know that the elderly deserve respect and recognition. Goneril and Regan are, as soon as possible, ready to take all power from their father and direct him completely. From King Lear, "Oh, sir, you are old. Nature in you stands on the very verge of his confine. You should be ruled and led by some discretion that discerns your state better than yourself." No wonder Lear rages against this. No wonder Saul's anger breaks out. So now let's look at the topic of dementia. Lear fears the madness he feels encroaching. "Oh, let me not be mad, not mad, sweet heaven. Keep me in temper, I would not be mad." Is there a hint, or more than a hint, that Lear suspected his turning mind and therefore felt he must divest his kingdom? And how aware was Saul? In the novel, dementia is so well depicted. My father had Alzheimer's, and I'm sure many of you have been touched by it. It's a big subject these days for books and films. Many of you may remember one of the first books on the subject, Still Alice, published in 2007, and also the beautiful and touchingly sad film Away from Her, based on an earlier Alice Munro story. And some of you may have heard Lisa Raitt speaking on CBC a while ago about her husband's young onset Alzheimer's. Heartbreaking. As our population ages, our parents and our own generation become sadly familiar with dementia. Kara says of Saul, something weird has been going on with him. And when Bee visits her father, she observes that her 79-year-old father, pillar of the community, seems to have cracked. There is also an interesting moment that I recognize when Bee realizes that they believed her father was raving when he spoke of the angel being defaced. But it was true. This is a challenge for all of those who love someone with dementia. They can also be capable of knowing, seeing, and doing things we think they are beyond. And we, those who love them, must be aware of that. Indeed, Saul has the insight to recognize that his daughter Kara's husband is betraying her with a chef. We see the familiar and necessary tests and legal steps, the acquiring power of attorney, and of course there we hear the echoes of Lear, taking away his car keys, the test for dementia, and the daughter's shocked recognition of how bad it is as he does the clock drawing. Saul's response when he is told he will need round-the-clock care is revealing and understandable. On the basis of what, he cries, counting backwards by sevens, drawing pictures of cubes? This is how you decide a man's fate? I'm delighted to tell you that I reached out to Claire Rothman and asked her if she had firsthand experience with dementia. She responded very generously and explained again about the actor who felt Lear had Lewy bodies. And she goes on to say, when I saw Lear as perhaps suffering from Lewy body dementia, the play, that is King Lear, just opened up for me. All the confusing little moments out on the heath made sense. For example, talking to a mouse that plainly is not there, mistaking a milking stool for his daughter. She continues, but firsthand experience? Yes. Thankfully, of a much gentler nature. In my own family, the dear ones who have lost memory and cognitive powers in age have become much gentler and more appreciative as the disease progresses. There have been moments of frustration and deep mourning, of course, moments of anger and rage, sure, but nothing homicidal. This is fiction, don't forget. In Lewy body's dementia, I am told progression can be quick. In other forms, much more gradual, giving family and sufferers time to adjust and adapt and even accept. That has been more in line with my personal experience, and I'm glad to say it was mine as well. I'll now talk about themes of identity. The theme of dementia is completely tied to that of identity and self-knowledge in both King Lear and in Lear's Shadow. As I've said a couple of times, the novel's epigraph is, who is it that can tell me who I am? Goneril and Regan observe about Lear, he hath ever but slenderly known himself, with the implication that self-knowledge was never his strength. Saul is much the same, and probably following the car accident, he avoided self-questioning. Early in the novel, Kara says of Saul to be, he's not himself. He's not himself. There is a use of disguise or masks in King Lear. Kent, Edgar, the Fool. We see the outside, but what is within? Bee thinks the play was full of disguises. She hadn't made up her mind what Shakespeare was trying to say, but the play seemed to turn on the question of appearances and what exactly lay beneath. How much might this be explored in Lear's Shadow? The mask thing may not be as strong, but think of Phil's womanizing bluster or Mimi's antagonism, or Kara's calmness, or Artie's quiet, or B's cleft palate, which hides the bee within through shyness, all masking their vulnerability. Identity in Lear's shadow is sometimes less dramatic and more tied to regular life. Saul's identification with the old plateau neighborhood. Roots, Saul says quietly, there's nothing more important in this life. That brings us to looking at the Jewish contents of the novel. Jewish Montreal is an important part of the setting, and Jewish custom is easily integrated into the book, like a reference to a rock on a grave or Shabbat candles. The Rose, or Rosenberg family, is obviously now secular, but there are references to Rosh Hashanah celebrations and temple attendance. Bee is surprised to find that her father has been saying Abba in his sleep and in his delusional moments. She finds out from Mimi what the word means. It is Mimi who coaxes Saul to talk about his father, their immigration from Poland, and the fact that Bee's mother had never converted. It is certainly then part of Saul's identity. And that brings us to Saul's father, from whom he was estranged. Why were they estranged? Is it that Saul is angry because he was poor? Or is it because his father might have rejected him when he married someone who wasn't Jewish? Or is it because through him, through Saul's father, Bee inherited the gene for her cleft, which the young Bee notices the first and only time she sees her grandfather? Quoting from the book, his nose was flat like hers, but most shocking of all, a white line shimmered on his upper lip, dividing his face in two. Bee had never seen this on an adult. This is what Bee thinks. Our grandfather was damaged. There was no place in Dad's life for damaged things. Bee's cleft is a huge part of her identity. She remembers Artie because he did not tease her and protected her during playground cruelty. She was never comfortable with her appearance, and her father's obsession with fixing her probably exacerbated that in her early years. She is at a turning point. Bee would turn 40 this summer, no man, no money, and a business on the point of collapse. She is mourning the loss of her partner, which reflects her larger loss of her mother years before. Change and growth and identity confusion are also reflected in the use of Alice in Wonderland in the novel. Bee is reading it to Kara's younger daughter and reflecting all the changes in that child's life. Quote, she was Alice, trying to find order in a world gone suddenly awry. Bee had forgotten how moving Alice Carroll could be. By chapter 5, Alice had already shrunk and grown and shrunk again. Now the caterpillar was in Alice's path. Who are you? He demanded. Poor Alice couldn't come up with an answer. She'd changed so many times that she no longer had a clue. Very early in the book, as Bee enters the room for the company party, it says, they were in a sort of tunnel that served as a vestibule. A curtain hanging at the far end hid whatever lay beyond. It had the feel of a fairy tale or Alice in Wonderland. Bee at the lip of a rabbit hole. This is definitely a novel of domestic drama. And I quote now from the introduction to my edition of King Lear. King Lear's analysis of the disintegration of the closest family ties, the resentment and violence underlying the most intimate relationships, has seemed to speak to peculiarly modern times. So how do we see this as a novel about fathers, which Rothman said she likes to write? Look at all of the family relationships in King Lear and in Lear's shadow. We have Lear and his 3 daughters. We have Gloucester and his 2 sons. We have Lear and his relationship with Kent. First Lear is the advisor, then Kent the caregiver, as a son. We have Saul and his two daughters, Phil and his daughter Angelina, Artie and his father, Saul and his father. Edmund says, "That which my father loses, no less than all, the younger rises when the old doth fall." Of course, Edmund is the villain of the play, but the message is apt. We also see the relationship between the two sisters. Kara as the super daughter, Bee, who can't operate a cell phone, and the warm relationship between Bee and her niece, and the different ways that Saul relates to them, partially due to the fact that Kara was too young to remember her mother, and perhaps due to Bee's cleft. And of course, Lear's shadow also includes a satisfying love story, the hopes for a new family blended of those who have survived the rough passage. So a little more on Lear's parallels now. Mimi explains Lear's enduring power. We can easily see the parallels and corresponding strengths in Lear's shadow. Mimi Mayer was addressing the actors. Lear was a masterpiece, she said, the jewel of the Shakespeare canon. The dramatic structure was pure brilliance, an architecture of symmetries and repetitions. And the themes of aging and parent-child dynamics were as relevant today as they had been in Shakespeare's England. Lear was one of the most poignant renderings of old age in all of literature. And then we come to Phil's attempt to apologize to his daughter. He was staring at his daughter as if she weren't quite real. He stopped buttoning his shirt and his hands fell to his sides. "Please, forgive me." He seemed to be referring to a state of undress. His legs and feet were bare, his shirt half open, but there might have been more to it. His daughter chose to interpret the words widely. Her chin started to quiver. And of course, we can see the parallel there to Lear and Cordelia at the end. Again, we have that weather, the storm, the tempest within and without. Lear's daughters are unfaithful to their husbands. Kara's husband is unfaithful to her. Bee's partner was unfaithful to her. The end of the novel combines, as it should, the joy of being in a relationship and the knowledge that there will always be sadness around Bee's father. It's very poignant that Bee recognizes Saul has gone even further than Lear. The sadness that her father would never have the moment of reversal that you see in the play. This man lying before her on the hospital bed had hurt her. He hadn't known what he was doing. She understood that. Yet she couldn't suppress the outrage that rose up in her now, heating her blood. Violence had been done. Her father had done it. She needed him to open his eyes. Cordelia had journeyed back to England from France to be with her father. For days, Lear had lain on his sick bed, unconscious, yet she had only to utter his name and the old king opened his eyes. Mimi had wept with Angelina as these things happened on stage. Bee had wept too, night after night in the dark. In the play, when Lear woke and saw Cordelia alive and well before him, he thought he was hallucinating. He couldn't believe it was really her, but his vision was clear, possibly for the first time in his life. This summer, Bee had learned that there was a moment in classical tragedy known as the reversal, a moment of acute human suffering during which wisdom has a chance to enter. In Shakespeare's last and greatest tragedy, after King Lear had lost everything he'd held most dear, he arrived at it. Solomon Rose would not. And no amount of hope or stubborn wishing could change that. Saul's mouth had closed again. In repose, in the frame of his white beard, his lips curved naturally into a frown. This, she supposed, was what would stay with her. This unhappy, downturned mouth was the image she would carry through the rest of her life. It's a tough passage. He may not have meant to have hurt her with that physical knife, but he had certainly hurt her in the past with his inability to see the girl beyond the cleft lip. And yet, B assumes a second chance at life, a rebirth. Although Artie wants her to help out with his upcoming production, B is her own person now. She is independent of both her lover and her father. And at the end, the Montreal angel, cleaned and restored after the chaos, is a symbol of hope. Okay, so that, thank you. That is my formal presentation, but I would love to hear from you, questions, comments. Anyone from Montreal who wants to say something about the setting of the book or anything else that you would like to say. I think if you maybe put up a hand and unmute yourself, there are not so many of us that I won't be able to see you.
Yeah, we have, I think 17 people on now because people had other, was such a busy day, it turned out, but anyways. So unmute yourself. We're just 17 people, so it's easy to have a conversation.
Susan, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you. That was wonderful. So I have to tell you that I read the book and I thought, oh, this was an interesting story, and it was okay. I wasn't kind of wowed with it. You've helped me to see it in a little bit of a different light. I think the reason why I reacted to it initially the way I did was it hit a little too close to home for me with reference to the dementia part and with reference to a parent. And I think that gave me a hard time really kind of enjoying it and getting as much out of it as I could, because I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was great. So having had time to reflect on it and listening to the points that you brought up and actually relating it back to the actual play, I really want to thank you because you have given me a better appreciation for the book. Like I now realize that I really liked it more than I initially thought that I did. And I think that that's what was kind of my barrier. There was just, that's true with anything that we read in that, you know what I mean? It sometimes if it hits too close to home, it has an impact. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan, for those comments. I would say that we all have those barriers, books with certain content, depending on what we go through. People would often, when I was, in the depths of things with my dad, people would offer me books about dementia or something, and that was exactly the last thing I would want to read. And it's for some people, it's the same with Holocaust literature. But I think this book has enough more going on, which helps us to enjoy it a little bit more than we might have if it was just about that dementia. So thanks, Susan. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Comments, maybe? Sorry, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes, go
about
ahead.
the title, The Lear's Shadow. You didn't really go into detail about it, even though I assume it's about the comparing it to the play, but interesting if you can talk more about the title.
Sure, and I'd love to hear if anybody else has more to add to it. I mean, I think shadow in that, I think the author is reflecting that it is a shadow of the original, like nothing could be as great as the original, but also the idea of a shadow as being, not the person, right? So Lear's shadow is Lear himself, but less. Saul himself, but less. You know, we sometimes say about people, he's a shadow of his former self. And also shadow implies a kind of darkness. And, you know, I think it's very interesting about the ending that we could have had a happy ending. We could have had Saul and Bee, you know, kind of reconciled, and off she goes with her lover and everything's okay. But, you know, it's a shadowy world that Saul is in. And it's a lifetime of hardness for Bee to overcome. So I think that's part of it too.
Thank you.
Barb, I think, has her hand up.
Sorry,
Yes.
Barb, I didn't
Hi.
see. Go ahead.
Hi. First of all, I really appreciate being here with you, and I really enjoyed listening today. I'd like to say a few things. Number one is, I think somewhere towards the end of the book, there was mention of Lear's shadow, and why it was probably called Lear's shadow is because Bee was Phil's shadow. Like, she had to follow him everywhere.
That's right.
And I think that's the sort of my opinion of why the book is called Lear's shadow, because they do mention that at somewhere towards the end of the book. And so Bee was Phil's or Lear's shadow. That was her job throughout the book once he was in the drunken stage at the early part of the book. And the other thing is, I am from Montreal, and I had no idea that the book was set in Montreal when I opened the book. And the first thing I hear is Park and Pine, and like I could still picture myself standing there and all the different streets and the different parks and everything. I felt like I was there. I felt like I was in the book. And so that drew me to the book. And another thing is all the different threads of different topics that are covered, as you mentioned. There are those, and there are many others that are intertwined. There's, you know, the girl who bought Goya, whatever her name is, who bought the studio, you know, and there are so many topics that I can relate to, I guess. You know, some of them great and some of them very sad and unfortunate, but it didn't matter because they were all kind of there in the book. And I enjoyed it for that reason, because I could relate to it either personally or sort of secondhand, but feel it as well. And I think that the author does a really good job of touching on topics that are meaningful to a lot of us. And that's why I enjoyed it anyways.
Barb, thank you. And thank you so much for that reminder about the title. I had forgotten it until you mentioned it. I did have a note here about what's that they say about, right, here it is. Early in the novel, Bee's boss, Dave Samuel, says there are two types of stage managers, sergeant majors and mothers. His only requirement of Bee is that she, a childless woman, be a mother. And, you know, one of my questions that I could have thrown out is, what is he getting at in this novel about fathers and daughters? How does motherhood fit in? But, you know, in a way, what you have brought up is exactly that. And again, a reversal, right? That Bee being a shadow or a mother, a caretaker.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And Brenda.
Okay, hi. First of all, I really did enjoy the book a lot. I didn't take offense to the fact that early on there's a comment that Bee is no longer young. She's almost 40. But what I wanted to say, it also relates to shadows. Remember how throughout the book, Bee has these nightmares that the house is sort of falling down around her.
Yes.
And there's no floor and everything is collapsing. So there's a point also towards the end where Mimi suggests that the woman in these nightmares is the shadow of you, of Bee. So what that suggested to me is it's a whole other dimension that we haven't really gotten to yet, is that, you know, the two daughters seem awfully negligent, like they don't want to face the fact of what's happening to their father, and they think, oh, he's fine all by himself. And of course, you know, things are fine until they're not. But what I got from this comment about the shadow being her is that despite this outward sort of cavalierness, maybe she does understand this might be her future too.
Wow, that's a dark one. Yep, we all think about that. You're right. That is a really dark thought. Yeah, I'm making a note of that. Whether I like it or not, could be her. I think, you know, it's really natural and realistic that sisters, I have one sister as well, will at first try not to completely come to terms with what appears to at first be normal memory loss and all of those things. The steps of their father, right? The steps have to keep getting, you know, worse before you think, okay, now I have to do something about it. And I think because it happened quite quickly for Saul, they were forced into taking action because there was his accident in the storm. But yes, it's true. They didn't immediately take the responsibility. On the other hand, I would say that there is this message in the book at the same time. You know, you have to take the responsibility, but you also have to give your father the respect. I mean, this is the hardest part, to give them the respect that they require while helping them with the help that they absolutely must have. And I felt that that was fairly depicted. Eleanor.
And also there, to build onto that, there's a tipping point, you know, at each stage you say, is this where we need to start doing more? And then you sort of get used to whatever's going on, and then things go down a little more. And then you say, well, is this the point? And, you know, I think too, that realistically, it's whether it's in dealing with a parent with Alzheimer's or dealing with a parent who has any kind of issue, you know, you don't want to jump in too fast, because, you know, once you go in, you can't step back again. So to me, that's what I also felt with the two sisters, that they, I mean, Brenda and I are sisters. And so we were talking about this yesterday, and you know, this idea that how hard it is to really recognize the moment when things really are what they are and not what you hope them to be, and that you really have to step in at that point to assist. And it's very hard to know when you're in the middle of it, exactly when the right time to step in is. Sometimes it's easier to look back later and say, you know, this was the right time, or we should have done this then, or we didn't need to do that at that point. But, you know, it's so much easier in retrospect to look back and see where you really should have intervened.
It is. Yeah, it's a tough thing to handle it well, and we all just pray that we do the best for our loved ones.
You do the best with what you've got, with what you know at the time. Yeah. You know, it's the same thing we say about raising our children, right? We did what the best we could with what we knew at the time. Yeah. And now we're all stupid. Now we don't know anything. Anybody else? Oh, Barb, I'm happy to see you finally got in.
Barb, you're
Yeah, you're muted. Yeah, no, we can't hear you yet. I think she's having trouble unmuting.
there now. I think she's unmuted. Nope, she's still. Yeah, sometimes this happens. You even unmute and you still can't be heard.
Yeah.
Sorry, Barb.
It's
You're-
okay. I already spoke.
Okay,
No, Barb, line one.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, we're not hearing you.
Sorry, Barb line one.
That technology, it's a pain sometimes. Anybody else? I know we've got some other people on who still on who were from Montreal.
Well, thank you. Unless there's another comment.
I have a question. One
Yeah.
more question.
That's
About
glorious.
you were talking about the angel. What was that referring to? You mentioned that.
Yeah, well, that's an angel in Montreal. I'm not from Montreal, so I understand there is this angel in Montreal, but I think it becomes a kind of overarching figure of love and protection. Also, I was drawing some parallels in my own study of this, which got me into thinking more about King Lear. And when I started thinking more about King Lear, I started seeing signs of the Akedah, the sacrifice of a beloved one in the story. And I did research on that and found that other people had felt that too. And so I thought that the angel in some ways was the intervener, allowing for a higher forgiveness.
Okay, interesting. And I'm just wondering, did he pass away in the end of the book? They didn't say, did they?
Oh, no, it's almost worse. Yeah, he's still there.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Oh, just one other thing, I don't know if people know this, that Robin Williams was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, and it's felt that that's why he took his own life. So, I mean, you can see the loss of control, that if you know it's coming, who wants that?
I didn't know that about Robin Williams. I didn't know that it was that. Sounds such a terrible thing. There can always be something worse than, my father had old-fashioned regular Alzheimer's. That's better. He was gentle.
Well, Cynthia, I want to thank you again for bringing such a depth of understanding to the book and bringing it to us. Anytime you've come to speak to us, you've really, I think, enriched all of our understandings of any book that you've talked about, with all the research you do and all the connections, and really bringing it to life and answering a lot of questions that we might have had as we read along in the book. So thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you have been part of our program.
Next time, folks, in person.
Yes, Olavai, that would be great.
Everybody stay well. We just have to hang on a little longer.
Yeah, so I also want to thank Susan Columbi and 147 Elder Street for their generous support for today's program. We have so many interesting programs coming up through Books and Bagels and Lunch and Literature. We do our best with the books, but for the time being, the food is all on you. Hopefully, we'll be able to be together and eat together in the not too distant future. On Sunday, April 18th, Toronto's own Sidura Ludwig will be talking about her new book, You Are Not What We Expected. We're looking for a sponsor for that date, so if you're interested, please contact me and I will be able to provide you with additional details. The following week, on Sunday, April 25th, we've had a new addition to our program. We'll be joined from Israel by Debbie Zimmelman and an Israeli soldier. Debbie is a photographer, and she created a photo journal of women on the front lines of the Israeli army. Her pictures are deeply evocative. There are other upcoming programs too, so please check the synagogue website regularly to see what we've been fortunate enough to add. Keep well. I wish everyone a happy and kosher Pesach, and share in your wish for us all to be able to celebrate face to face with our families again next year. Thank you everyone for attending.